The Last of Us Part 2 is a video game.
Thanks, Sherlock.
Of course. However, this video game is not about fun. Which is not to say that there aren't good moments embedded within it, or that I didn't enjoy the playing experience for bursts at a time throughout my 25-hour initial playthrough, nor does it mean that I went in closed-minded. I actually was anticipating this game and approached it with an open mind, all the while hoping for the best. As this is a video game and thus has gameplay, I will cover that aspect. But as this is a story-driven presentation, that receives priority and will accordingly take up most of the attention in this video. This will be an unbiased review, and I will try to be as objective as I possibly can. But first, let's start with some subjectivity. My desire to play. For future fans coming to The Last of Us 2, it may be impossible to comprehend the atmosphere for the fans that waited this game upon its initial release, particularly with the climate of perception surrounding the leaks and the grim shadow they cast on the launch. A lot of people have a negative reception about The Last of Us Part 2 because they went in with pessimistic expectations. Others were downright disinterested because they had the whole game spoiled for them vicariously. This storyline and what the writers have done to the characters have caused a lot of fans to notably say this about Naughty Dog.
Fuck these motherfuckers.
Yeah, fuck 'em.
Pretty messed up.
Stupid dog.
Okay, that's enough. While I do understand their frustration, their qualms about the perceived virtue signaling by a major marketing studio, I feel like a lot of these grievances are misguided, and this is not coming from a longtime fan of this intellectual property. Now, for a disclaimer. I always thought the original game was overrated, and so is Part 2, especially judging by the critic score on Metacritic, which is certainly not deserving of a 95, but I also don't think it's that bad. It also certainly does not deserve a 3.4 either. I wanted to be surprised and mesmerized by The Last of Us Part 2, a game that took 7 years in development. I wanted to be exhilarated. I wanted to look for the light. There was none, or at least not much. The overall mood and intent of the game is not to thrill or excite the player. It is to create tension and force the player to pontificate about moral dilemmas. It's a full-blown AAA highbrow morality play, and that is made clear to be the objective in the opening hours, which are slow, detached, and self-reflective. Even just the 30-second opening shot of a blood-drenched Ellie intently staring at you at the beginning of launching the application wants you to feel uncomfortable and keep you in a state of confliction. The theme of Last of Us 2 is all about conflicted feelings, but more often than not, we are manipulated to seek the destructive path, the path of self-hate and a thirst for vengeance, not unlike the path chosen by the characters. If the first game was a jubilee, a celebration of life and love, this game plays like an elegy, a poem about death and hatred. The opening sequence establishes what most people already know or could infer from the first game's ending. Joel's selfish action at the finale of Part 1 was a gamble with diminishing returns, and this misdeed has created a rift between himself and Ellie. That's not a bad start to the game so far. But we learn later that there are more far-reaching consequences that lie in wait, many of them dealt to us through a meandering plot. The most provocative moments of Part 2's story are, naturally, told through flashbacks, first from Ellie's perspective, and then from that of the ostensible antagonist. From here, you start to see a pattern. Both are female. Well, at least Ellie is. I think Abby is more so up to interpretation. In Ellie's flashbacks, the focus is on the relationship between Joel and Ellie, a study of their bond and all of the intertwined complexities as we follow them on their journey through the post-apocalyptic landscape together. Particularly of intrigue is a series of revelations and clues that lead Ellie on a search to finding out the truth about that day at the Firefly Hospital, and all of the guilt and contempt manifested from this discovery. These are brilliant sequences that stir and stimulate the player, giving real life to the story, forcing us to ask questions as we are teased with possible answers. If the entire game had been centered on this aspect alone, it would be a delight to play, no doubt. But then, enter Abby. Now, Abby is not the worst character to be conceived in this franchise, not even the worst character in this game. But Abby's storyline does feel like more of a burden on the overall lore and a distraction from the main event rather than an added escapade. Making it midway through the game offers some pivotal scenes of character development for Ellie that had me on the edge of my seat, pondering and anxiously awaiting the next story development, but then the game inexplicably changes gears and shifts to playing as Abby, breaking the flow of concentration and releasing that buildup of momentum. Playing as Abby in the middle of the game is the part where The Last of Us Part 2 goes from good to bad to worse. Chock full of cringy lines and introducing one of the most contrived and pointless subplots seen in a AAA game. Contrived to make the player sympathize with the game's supposed villain. More on this in a bit. I'm starting to lose track of continuity, just like the game's plot. Ellie and Abby each have a point of view and are on a quest for retaliation. The truth is, the game's thesis is that there are no true heroes or villains. Not in this world. If two wrongs don't make a right, then simply suffering is the price to pay for survival. But that doesn't mean that the developer doesn't want you to commiserate with the characters, to offer up a sympathetic narrative to reject retribution. There are a few problems with this gimmick. Firstly, the writer's idea of character development in the story is to simply kill off the best new characters, like Jesse and Manny respectively, or Joel in a cameo appearance, with abrupt and sudden executions. Abby is not a fundamental flaw in the game, and the performance by Laura Bailey is actually a remarkable one. The issue of the inclusion of the Abby character is not necessarily because of some identity crisis, but rather with an inability to fit organically or cohesively into the story. What real reason do I have to care about the new characters? Abby and her friends and that which they have lost are retconned into the fray. If you don't know what retcon means, that is to say, retroactive continuity, and if you don't know what either of those words mean, use Google. I could really rail on Naughty Dog for the manipulative marketing campaign and deceiving trailers for The Last of Us Part 2. The title of this video could itself be propaganda, so let me stop for a second and be honest with you. Did I myself enjoy playing the game? The answer is yes, for a certain duration, but I was also burned out about halfway through the exhaustive exploration. I would talk about plot holes, but this game's story changes so much from one scene to the next, I'm not sure it's even a cohesive narrative from one scene to the next. The game's most powerful scenes are well written and carry real emotional weight, but then other scenes deprive those powerful scenes of their gravity by undermining the build-up and the pieces that were in place. There is no real pause for thought for Joel's death, which I suppose is the right choice, as it is a jarring moment and the reflection comes later after the cat and mouse chase between Ellie and Abby. But there are certainly frequent reminders of how dirty Abby, did him. On the surface level, The Last of Us Part 2 amounts to little more than a narrow-minded revenge thriller. There were no true happy moments in the game, except for the astronaut sequence and the birthday flashback. The jokes told are veiled contempt through sarcasm and detached from reality itself. Another major problem is that Joel's death can be said to be contrived, as Joel in the first game was portrayed as a cunning survivalist, able to perceive a threat and especially an ambush right away. Joel shouldn't and probably wouldn't have let his guard down so easily. But I can see both sides here. This idea to kill Joel in and of itself is bold and actually could have made sense under different circumstances, but the first game establishes that Joel deserves much better than to be killed off in such a sudden and trivial way by a character that arguably had no reason to exist. I do think that Joel's death opens up the path for the rest of the game to be a period of reflection for Ellie, for her to find meaning in his action to spare her life. But in his death, Ellie spends her time consumed by a cat and mouse chase and ultimately renders Joel's sacrifice in vain. I see Joel as a martyr, a sacrificial lamb for a morality play about quote-unquote strong female characters. Joel's death at first, and especially the way they handle it, a lot like BioShock, serves as little more than a MacGuffin or a plot device to catalyst the revenge porn narrative. It's not the most contrived death in a video game, but it does seem like one of the most thoughtless. It seems as though the patriarchal protagonist was killed off just to satisfy some twisted ideology about diversity and female empowerment in video games. And I get it, the need for a strong female identity, a heroine, so to speak, is a vital component of most great video games. But what about the strong male character? And not just the type that can kick ass and chew bubblegum at the same time, but the one that is capable of compassion, restraint, and vulnerability. A strong male character that reckons with the cruelty of the world but has the foresight to see a light and have a reason to fight. You had that with Joel, and he's immolated off to indulge some SJW leaning about toxic masculinity and quote-unquote inclusion. He's the whole reason for the fighting in this game. The ending of the game is probably the most exciting for me, the most engaging, and the most emotional. It gets a little bit batshit, but it feels like the game took way too long to get to this point. If 2/3 of Abby's playthrough had been cut, the pacing would have felt much more natural. She gets too much screen time, as do the second-rate characters. Seeing Abby stripped down to the bone, bruised, beaten, and defeated is actually a very poetic way to end this story. Both main characters have lost just about everything, have gone to the depths of depravity they never imagined they would, satisfied their bloodlust, but yet neither of them is better for it. If you saw spoilers instead of playing it firsthand, this would inevitably have created an innate bias in your mind against the game, allowing you to dismiss it without the proper insight that a first-hand experience would have granted you. I think that as its own separate game, it would have been really good. But as a sequel to The Last of Us Part 1, I don't know if it does it the right kind of justice. It could be said that no single scene in The Last of Us 2 is as good as the ending of Last of Us 1, with the incredible foreboding ambiguity. No single scene is as thought-provoking. It wasn't meant to be a cliffhanger, or at least not a sequel that led to this. Even for all the talk about brutality in this game, none of it really compares to the scene where Ellie puts an end to Dave. But that one scene is done with so much more purpose than anything in The Last of Us 2. A lot of the moments in The Last of Us 2 simply feel gratuitous and forced. The combat is a formality, with long stretches of dull moments where there is no interactivity except for looting and finding the collectibles. I suppose that with scarce resources, it's never a waste to explore, as you will find upgrades, resources, and collectibles. And I wouldn't say the combat is downright boring, but it is rather derivative and at times mundane through repetition. But maybe this could be said about any game. At the same time, it is extremely brutal and rather satisfying to pull off such devastating finishers on foes both human, zombie, and in between. There is little sympathizing with the victims, although you might feel a little psychopathic after all the bloodlust, especially when killing named NPCs or someone's best friend. It's a shared experience as a cycle of violence. A few new enemies crop up every now and then to give more variety, and as annoying as they can be, they keep the pressure on you. This game is very dark, figuratively and literally, and that adds more stress to the survival setting. The set pieces are large but easily traversable, though lacking the variety of approach that Uncharted 4 offered for dealing with enemy encounters. Combat is, for the most part, fluid, but many fights can be skipped by running to an exit and mashing or holding down a button. The few forced mandatory fights in the game are unique, but mostly underwhelming, and seem almost scripted to win. There is a surprise mini-boss fight or two that does make the scarcity of ammo and reliance on There is integrity inherent with the design quality of The Last of Us Part 2 with incredible production values, but you would be forgiven for thinking that, at its core, The Last of Us 2 feels a little soulless. Predictably, The Last of Us 2 succeeds as a technical marvel in world rendering, full of vibrant and fanciful immersive level of design, featuring state-of-the-art platforming, varied over-the-shoulder combat, and cinematic, epic proportioned set pieces, all benchmarks we have come to expect from Naughty Dog. But the key trait ingredient noticeably absent is the compelling narrative, simplicity, and integrity that we've come to know and cherish. The gloomy overtone and dismal vibe is for all the wrong reasons. It's a very bleak and depressing game. I'm not sure if I've ever felt more depressed and saddened by the end of a game. And there's little replay value for the gameplay itself. Harder difficulties serve to stress more than satisfy with attrition-style mechanics. Not all cliffhangers warrant or imply a sequel. That narrative focus is derailed in the sequel, which is not exactly a deserving one. It's almost as though this game was designed to make the player suffer. What a sadistic passion project indeed. Do I recommend it? Not for a level of enjoyment, but for a lesson. A lesson of perhaps not how to make a video game. Politics should almost never be implanted into a game, much less a quote-unquote work of art. At least not overtly, not without satire and subversion. So don't believe the lies and hypocrisy of Neil Druckmann. Naughty Dog is basically chasing Amy Hennig at this point. Her vision and the direction of Bruce Straley are missing. They were the guiding lights. So does this game exist for no reason other than to make the player suffer, just as the characters throughout the story despair? I'm not sure. But it was certainly part of the intent, and this is evident straight from the horse's mouth when Neil Druckmann sat up on the stage back in 2016 and said this is a game about hate. And unfortunately for Naughty Dog, a lot of the fans feel that way as well. This will go down as one of the most polarizing video games ever made. But let me make one thing very clear to you about The Last of Us Part 2. It is not in any way, shape, or form a complete failure, despite what a lot of people on the internet will say. A lot of these people are predisposed against the game. I myself did not appreciate the first game as much as some, but I certainly went into this game with an objective and open-minded perspective. I do think that this game succeeds on an emotional level, and if it doesn't hit you that way, then perhaps it won't succeed at all. I felt so drained at the end of this game, expecting so much more, and I don't think any story has left me this depressed in a while, and probably not from any game. Now, if it ends up being that was what Naughty Dog was going for, then they certainly achieved it. But again, this is not to say that The Last of Us Part 2 is a total failure, but rather that its reach exceeds its grasp. Its indulgence is greater than the fans' appetite for a sequel. Just like its own ending, The Last of Us Part 2 is unsure of itself. As a two-part story, The Last of Us, the whole is not greater than the sum of its parts.